Well, welcome everyone to what I think is going to be an extraordinarily interesting, I know will be an extraordinarily interesting conversation, and one that's also so very timely. We're sorry that we all cannot be with everyone live at the IIC. That's something which, of course, we're looking forward to doing sometime in the very near future. But we're going to have a conversation here with Mauricio Ramos, who, as everyone knows, is the CEO of Millicom, and Ajit Pai, who wears many hats, but one of his hats has been the extraordinarily successful tenure he's had as chairman of the FCC up until very, very recently, and now is off doing a variety of other things in the private sector. So if I could start, Mauricio, maybe if you don't mind, I'll start with you and ask you, it's been close to 18 months since COVID really started to hit the world. How has COVID affected your operations, particularly those in Latin America?
Oh, thank you, Ross. It's good to see you again. And Ajay, good to see you again. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. It's a phenomenal crowd. COVID for us has been a roller coaster, and one of the scary types, so not one of the fun types. Obviously, when it first started, we saw that it was a big crisis. Health crisis, soon to become an economic crisis, potentially a financial crisis. And now we see that it's social and political in some of the markets in Latin America. So what concerned me the most was the lack of visibility that we would have, because it was one of those that you knew was going to be very difficult to maneuver, yet had no end in sight. And even today, I'm not sure that anyone really knows what the end of it will be, because particularly in Latin America and in the Caribbean, the vaccination process is not as advanced as it could be, and as that one in the developed markets. We still have a lot of uncertainties. So we came about it with two big questions back in April of last year. One was, what is going to be Tigo Millicom's role in all of this? What's our responsibility? Because we have a purpose to build digital highways for the markets we operate in. And number two was simply, how are we going to deal with all of our stakeholders? Because we have a stakeholder approach to what we do, our communities, our employees, our investors, and of course our customers, and it's going to be tough. So we're not going to necessarily be able to service all of them. Answering the first question was extremely easy. It was about our purpose now is more important than ever. And Ajit, I'm sure you show this with many operators around the world. It's about keeping the networks up and running, making sure service is there 24/7. This is, maybe we're not nurses, we're not doctors, but we're the second line. It's got to run. I've been in situations in which, in a moment of a crisis, the telecom networks fail and the social fiber disappears very, very quickly. So we told all our employees we got to be there. So that was easy in the sense of figuring out what our responsibility was. The harder part was, okay, we're going to be there for our customers, but there's going to be increased demand for broadband at home and decreased demand for broadband out on the mobile networks. How are we going to cope with this? And we knew there was going to be 2 times the need for capacity on the fixed networks, and people would expect it for free. We knew households, because we live in America, we've seen financial crises before, they would be out of money. And we would not be willing or able to cut service. We just said, we're not going to do it. And we made that decision early on. So there was going to be a lot of financial pressure on the business. And our employees, rightly so, would be fearing to go out, concerned for their own health, to go out when everybody was being told to stay home. So we knew we had a strong responsibility, but we were going to have a money problem. I'm just being as simple as it is. Cash was going to be difficult. Investment was going to be required, and something would have to give. So we went back and said, okay, what are we going to do here for our 4 key stakeholders? So to our communities, we said to ourselves and to all the regulators around the world, we're going to keep those digital highways up and running 24/7, 365 days, and we're going to put the money that we need on CMTSs, routers, and in Latin America, international bandwidth. We went out and bought additional international bandwidth because the internet in Latin America does not sit inside the country. And we said, we're going to take that in the chin. To our customers, we said, the product and the service, will be up and running for you. And this was bold, but we said, we're going to continue to give it for free to those who cannot pay. Not everyone, but those who cannot pay. So it won't be free for all forever, the 3Fs, as many governments wanted us to do, but it certainly will be for those who can't pay. And leave it to us to do market segmentation, right? To deal with up and down on the minimum product tier that we created, which effectively was free for those who couldn't pay. It was really a good moment in which we worked with many governments and basically told them, let us do this, and we guarantee that nobody will go unconnected. At some point in time, we had more than 1 million people connected to a for-free product, minimum product, for-free product. To our employees, we said, we're going to protect you with PP&E. Rest assured, you're not a doctor, you're not a nurse, but you're needed. You have to go out there. We gave them a sense of purpose, and we told them early on, we're not going to let anyone off. I went out and made a guarantee to our employees, as we did to our customers, Tigo is not laying anyone off because we're going to need you. And here's the point here. The fourth one of our stakeholders is our investor base. Something's got to give, right? And we went out in April of last year and we told them, not in these words, but pretty much, it's actually you. You're going to have to sit this one out. Didn't quite say it this way, but effectively you're paying the bill. Because for us, the only way to protect your long-term shareholder value is to protect the equity, the credibility of the company in our markets towards our consumers and our regulators, which effectively means it's about brand equity, it's about brand recognition, it's about the customer staying with us for the long term. And you're not going to get any shareholder remuneration, neither this year and possibly not in 2021. So we went out, and to protect the cash flow, we basically said to investors, you're not getting any shareholder remuneration. Cut our dividends, cut our buyback products. The stock went down 50% the minute I sat down. And guess what? It was the right thing to do, because it allowed us to keep investing in the business as soon as we knew that people were going to come back to the streets. So we continued to build a network in Colombia, for which we had just bought spectrum. The same in El Salvador, for which we had just bought spectrum. We continued to invest. We modernized networks in Panama and in Nicaragua. And the whole mix of this was that we, I believe, gained credibility with our customers, gained credibility with regulators. We sustained the importance of the brand. And as we sit here today to finally finish the story on what you asked, it worked. It worked because 18 months after the pandemic, we have, as a result of investment and having stayed with our customers, 8% more mobile customers that we had before the pandemic. They really did come back once mobility was there. 8% more home broadband customers that we did before the pandemic, because we gave them a minimum product so they could stay with us, and they're now paying us. And even our revenue began to recuperate. So we've learned a lot of lessons. And the most important one is you gotta walk the talk if you really do believe that you got more than just the investors or stakeholders. And sometimes you cannot really give it all to all of them.
That's terrific. And the bottom line, the lesson about what worked and the importance of investment really resonates. I just had the pleasure and the honor of being at the Mobile World Congress this past week in Barcelona. And one of the things that I got a lot of questions about, and was very much a part of the conversation amongst regulators, ministers, and others there, was how did the United States do so well in this? And by well, they're really talking about the reliability of the broadband, the ubiquity, recognizing it wasn't totally universal, and there are important lessons there. But the US clearly was seen as a leader. Nothing went down, the services were provided. Can you talk a little bit about the lessons that you've seen and the way in which you challenged the industry and allowed the industry to make the investments that were required over the past few years or so to be ready for this event that nobody anticipated?
It's a great question, David. But before we begin, let me thank you for hosting this conversation. Thank Amanda and the extraordinary team at IIC for giving us this forum. And of course, to be on the same panel with the exceptional Mauricio, who's done a great job leading a company during a very tumultuous time. It's a privilege to be with all of you. David, you put your finger on one of the key things that we had to confront about 15 months ago. I was on March 13th, 2020. I remember sitting at my desk realizing the entire country of the United States, some hundreds of millions of people, would be shifting to working from and learning from and just being at home, and what an extraordinary effect that would have on our broadband networks. So immediately we issued a challenge that we called the Keep Americans Connected Pledge, a challenge to all of America's hundreds of broadband providers to not cut off consumers for the inability to pay, which Mauricio talked about with respect to Latin American consumers. Number two, to waive any late fees that might be associated with those charges, those services. And number three, to open up Wi-Fi hotspots to any who might need them. And ultimately, over 800 broadband providers took that pledge, and they ensured that in those dire early months when nobody knew exactly what was going to happen, the one thing they could rely on was their broadband connections at home, and that was absolutely vital. But I would argue that the core decisions we made that ensured that America's broadband networks held up during the pandemic were made before anybody even heard of COVID-19. Starting in January 2017, when I took office, until my very last day in January 2021, we took a lot of steps to remove regulations that were obsolete, to mitigate those, to adjust them to in the light of market realities. And all of those different reforms had a significant effect. Of course, the removal of Title II regulation is a good example, but many, many others, encouraging companies, for example, to focus their wireline investments on fiber, as opposed to propping up the fading copper infrastructure of yesteryear, flooding the market with spectrum, and making it easier to deploy wireless infrastructure so those cell sites could get deployed and the spectrum could be utilized in a quicker manner. As a result of all of these different reforms on the wireline and wireless side, when the pandemic hit, we had infrastructure networks in residential communities that were able to withstand the 25–30% increase in traffic at peak times that we saw. And so I think that that was a key part of our decision making. A lot of these decisions can't be made ad hoc. You have to architect these networks for the long term in mind. And the only way you can do that is not just by waving a wand when an emergency strikes, but by regulators taking a forward-thinking view. How do we incorporate an inflation factor, so to speak, in terms of internet traffic into our decision-making? The only way to do that is to encourage infrastructure investment. I'm glad we did that in 2017 because it stood us in good stead in 2020.
So Mauricio, in terms of infrastructure investment, it's been an extraordinarily interesting time for you and for Millicom. You've gotten out of some markets. You've made major investments in other markets. Can you talk a little bit to Ajit me a bit how you make those decisions? How important is the regulatory environment, the rule of law environment, the general economic impact, especially in light of the past 15 months or so, COVID, which has really underscored the dynamics of the market?
So we've taken a view that this sector, the telecom sector, is not the sector of 10, 15 years ago, which was full of cash and a cash cow to the investors. It's quite the opposite today, because in a data-hungry world, there's just no limit to what investors, to what consumers can consume. And as a result of that, your installed capacity is never enough. That's just, this is not the world of voice, where an individual can speak 24 hours, 7 days, and you know that there's a given number of individuals in your market. This is a different world. Individuals can have multiple sessions, they can have multiple equipments connected, and the number of things that can go on the network is unlimited. So it's a different world. It's a world in which investment needs to be continuously made. So we were an operator that was playing a thin game, both in Africa and Latin America. I took the view that that's no longer possible. That's no longer possible. So first capital investment decision is, you gotta focus, because this is a capital intensive business, no longer a cash flow. You gotta invest a lot to keep up to speed. So we moved out of Africa, we sold positions in 6 countries and took that money and brought it all to Latin America, buying into some geographies and basically focusing the money on the network. And that's the second important capital decision that I took when I joined Millicom Tigo 5 years ago, which is a telecom operator cannot be a jack of all trades. You cannot be Amazon and also a network operator. You cannot be Netflix and also a network operator. You got to figure out what business you're in. And we took the view that our business was connectivity, building those digital highways, like perhaps Verizon did in the US and AT&T is now going back to doing. And the way some of the cable operators have that view, I sit on the board of Charter and they have that view. We're in the broadband connectivity game. So the second decision is we put our money in the networks. And Ajit was talking about that, the importance of the network. If your job towards your community is that connectivity, you better be allocating your money to that. That's the second view that we took. So geography on the networks. And then we try to focus on markets in which the regulators understand the importance of the network for their countries. And they're supportive of that, whether it comes to spectrum decisions, infrastructure decisions, and take a longer term view. That's the criteria we use. The last criteria we use is, this is a game of scale. And our markets are small. So Ajit knows this because creating scale in the US is important and it's a huge market. Now, imagine our markets, Panama, Honduras, El Salvador, anywhere, they're smaller markets. So we need to find the ability to create scale within that market. So these are markets in which we need to have large positions, because on mobile, you got to cover with your network the entire, and markets in which the industry takes 2 to 3 players, no more than that. Because you cannot be building mobile networks. The US builds 3, maybe 4 for the entire country. Our countries need to be at least like that, 2 to 3 only. So those are our key 4 criteria.
Well, let me pick up a little bit on that structural piece, because it's obviously been very controversial and lots of discussion about how many players in a market. You talk about the smaller countries. Ajit, one of the real controversial decisions that you were a part of at the FCC was we had traditionally 4, often sometimes even more, nationwide players in the wireless space. And with the merger of Sprint and T-Mobile, we really now have 3 major national players. How is that? How did you make that decision, and how has it worked out? Again, from an investment perspective, and particularly for T-Mobile now being such a strong player.
Good question. So in terms of how we made the decision, essentially, as I looked at it, we were merging into a 5G environment where a tremendous amount of capital was going to be required in order to build a next generation network. And you would need a spectrum position that would allow you to leverage both low, mid, and high band spectrum. And to me, it was quite obvious that Sprint didn't have either of those on its own. And honestly, neither did T-Mobile. I mean, T-Mobile had good assets in low band 600. Had some millimeter wave, but didn't have mid-band spectrum assets. And so the combination of those two, we thought, would provide a turbocharged competitor that was going to be willing and able to take on the 5G challenge. And I think in the years since that decision was approved almost 2 years ago now, we have been proven correct in almost every respect. T-Mobile today serves approximately 250 million Americans with a high-speed 5G network. And what's very interesting to me is that this decision hasn't operated in a vacuum, because there is now a third competitor, which is very much focused on 5G, as opposed to T-Mobile, a competitor without scale, and Sprint, which was a fading fourth competitor. Now AT&T and Verizon are focusing on the core part of the communications business. We've seen in recent months, for example, AT&T essentially moving away from some of the legacy investments it made in DirecTV and in Time Warner, and focusing really on the core part of the business, which is the communications sector. Same thing with Verizon in terms of the Yahoo and AOL deals. And I think that the fact that the C-band auction that concluded on my watch was such a success is attributable in part because AT&T and Verizon realized, oh gosh, we've now got a T-Mobile, which has tremendous mid-band spectrum assets in 2.5 gigahertz. If we don't participate in the C-band auction and win, we are really going to be left behind. And that's part of the reason we saw bidding intensity that exceeded what anybody thought was possible. I mean, Verizon alone bid, when you incorporate the clearing cost, something like $51 billion, which is larger on its own than the biggest spectrum auction the FCC had ever held in history. So to me, at least, even though there's a reduction in the number of nationwide competitors, what we have is a much stronger wireless marketplace, which will redound in the long run to the benefit for consumers, especially the 5G consumers in the future.
So
David, if I may, because
yeah, Marcia,
I think Ajit has touched on really good points there, and obviously he's led the U.S. industry for a number of years, and the world looks at the U.S. for guidance, particularly Latin America. I got to tell you this story. When we were selling out of Rwanda as part of this geographical allocation process, we went to see the president and his ministers and said, we need you to bless this. Your market's going to consolidate into 2 players. But it's a 4 million people market. We think it makes sense for the reasons that Ajit was mentioning. You really only should have 2 networks. If you have 4, nobody makes any money, and it's just crazy. And he literally stopped me, and I said, no, I actually get it. I actually get it, because every time I have spectrum, one of you guys is not making any money because you've only got 10, 15% market share. You cannot invest. You don't want to invest, and you block my spectrum. What I want and what I need is 2 really strong players. I'll regulate them, I'll make them invest, but I cannot have these weak players anymore. Very interesting, very bold, and it's worked really, really well. In Panama, Congress actually said 4 is too many. We'll be happy with 3, and passed legislation to say, if you guys consolidate, I'm happy with 3. So there's really a change in what this business should look like because of the amounts of money it needs.
It seems to me, for both of you, I'd like you to comment. Those views were starting to really ripen pre-COVID. Ajit, as you point out, the decision to allow 3 players nationwide was made pre-COVID. In light of the things that we've learned about the COVID environment, and in particular, the importance of this industry, not just for this industry, for all the people it employs and all the services it renders, but really because the rest of a nation's economy now rests on the robustness and the reliability of telecommunications in ways that we've never seen before. How has this affected, do you think, the thinking about the importance of investment in new technologies, in sufficient spectrum, in being able to service the broader economy? Ajit, how do you see that? You've got to have had a global perspective as well.
Yeah, it was a good question. I think it certainly has focused the minds of both companies, but also regulators on the need to set up a framework that encourages infrastructure investment. That's certainly something I saw at the FCC, but even in my current position, full disclosure, I'm a partner at Searchlight Capital Partners, which is a private equity firm that invests in the communications space. And one of the things we see is that it's no longer the company that is simply providing cash flow and is, has a good exit multiple and the like that is attractive, but it's what you need to have is a company that is focused on investing in the network. It sounds great to be able to say, okay, we've got this many subs, we've got this kind of free cash flow, et cetera. But if in the long run, you aren't investing in your network, ultimately you're not serving your consumers, you're not going to be benefiting the country, and it's not going to be as good of an investment for anybody. And so I think it really underscores the fact that we need to make sure that every company, whether it's on the wired side or on the mobile side, has the strongest incentive to invest. And as Mauricio knows better than anybody, consumer demand is only going to increase from here on out. When applications like telehealth and AR, VR and other things like that start to really take off, we are going to need the networks themselves to scale accordingly. And to me, at least, it just underscores one of the things I talked about when I was in office at the FCC. Networks don't have to be built. Capital doesn't have to be raised. Work crews don't have to be hired. Networks don't have to exist. And so the more difficult the regulatory burden is on these companies to build those next generation networks, the less likely consumers are going to be able to benefit from them. So I would hope that regulators going forward would not just adjust the regulatory burden, but also recognize that there could be a role in government for actually encouraging this kind of innovation, whether it's existing companies that want to invest more in new spectrum assets or new companies like low Earth orbit satellites or whatever that want to enter the marketplace. We need to make sure that any business using any technology can find a home in any given country.
Mauricio, I assume you see it similarly, but particularly if you could talk a little bit about, when we talk about consumers, we often think about the individual, as important as that is, both for health, education, basic communications and so forth. But I think one of the things that really has become clearer because of COVID is the importance of this technology for business. And of course, every country relies upon its business for the well-being of its people. Can you talk a little bit about how you see that piece of the puzzle evolving over the past couple of years, and most importantly, how it's going to evolve going forward?
Yeah, I'm gonna take it from where Ajit left it and get to the small business, because Ajit's perspective was really spot on and phenomenal. One of the most smart regulators, and now seeing that everything he did makes sense from the investment side, because now he's making decisions on where to put the money, and how important it is to business. And I like the way you put it. It doesn't have to happen. People actually have to make an investment decision. So I want to take that to Latin America and make a couple of additional points. So the US is the largest capital market in the world. So operators in the US have access to the largest capital market to fund long-term investment decisions, as Ajit was saying. We don't in Latin America. So these investments that need to attract money, they actually need to attract money from New York, from Stockholm in our case, as much as Boston or London. And I'm going to use this because this is very important. Any spectrum decision, any infrastructure layout decision needs to be sold in Latin America and financed by investors that largely do not sit in Latin America. I'm going to use my own balance sheet as an example, Millicom's or Tigo's balance sheet. Our market cap is around $4 or $5 billion, and our debt is about $8 billion. So call it a $13 billion enterprise, give or take. All of our investors are based in Boston, New York, Stockholm, or London. So all of the equity, all of the $4 to $5 billion are being funded by foreign investors into Latin America. And our $8 billion of balance sheet, only 30% is raised in Latin America. The rest is international, which effectively means 80% of that investment is coming from abroad. So think of that. Think of that in terms of the effect decisions on spectrum, renewal of licenses, access to infrastructure has on investors that do not actually have to do it. In the context of a sector which is no longer a cash cow. Therefore, that money can go elsewhere. It can go into the US. And this then leads me to the point of, all right, how do we get that investment to come here? We get it by providing stable regulatory frameworks, trying to be, as Ajit was saying, just a lot more friendlier. It doesn't mean we got to guarantee returns, but we certainly got to do things like really focus on what price we're asking for spectrum. Because here's this big second difference between the US and Latin America. Ajit, you may correct me. ARPUs in the mobile world in the US are 120, 140. ARPUs in Latin America are 5. The same, look at his face, the same networks need to be built, right? Consumptions, of course, are less, right? How does it come to be? How does it come to be? We just have to be more agile. Obviously, costs of labor are shortening in America, but we gotta make it work somehow. And this goes into the point of spectrum, that Ajit was mentioning. A successful license in the US certainly can be about money. It cannot be like that in Latin America, because the more you charge for the spectrum, the more you're making it difficult for that capital to get a return. And I'll give you just one of the more concerning things that I have, David. You would think that spectrum would go cheaper in relative terms than it does in the US. It actually goes for about 4 to 5 times on an adjusted GDP per capita basis that it does in the US. How crazy is that? Ajit, would you imagine if you were the FCC head for all Latin America and I told you this? You would kind of go, well, for the next crisis, we're not going to have resilient networks because the math doesn't add up. So this is a wake-up call, and I realize that I'm arguing my own point, but I wouldn't do it if the numbers were not real. So that's really kind of, let's change the paradigm. Spectrum needs to be put on the table. Ajit, I think the spectrum in the US is auto-renewed and you got 20 years on it or something. we still got 5 to 10 years on our renewal of our licenses, and they're not automatic. So, you know, there's just a lot of things that in the mix that I want this group to weigh in.
Actually, that may be a good lead in for you for a couple of things. One of which, if you wouldn't talk about, is you talked about the success of the C-band auction, which was extraordinarily successful in all ways. But auction designs achieve different results based upon what type of design is used. There's some design, such as was used in Europe in 2000 in the 3G period, which basically bankrupted almost all the European carriers, so they could not build out 3G, and there were huge implications associated with that. And that was because of the design of that auction was to raise money rather than just to allocate efficiently. Can you talk a little bit about how you thought about auction design and the purpose of auctions in terms of the ability to allocate spectrum versus raising capital?
Yes, that was certainly one of the things that we took into account, the purpose of raising revenue for the United States Treasury, but it wasn't the only factor that went into our thinking. I mean, obviously, our top goal was to make sure that we were able to transition the spectrum, which historically had been used by satellite operators, into hands of the wireless industry, and to allocate it in a way that would yield the highest value to use. And how did we do that? Well, partly by making sure that we had geographic units that would be appealing to a wide variety of wireless companies. Partly, we also wanted to make sure that we were doing it in a time frame that recognized the national priority of 5G deployment. And so we had the accelerated relocation payments to encourage satellite operators to relinquish it years sooner than otherwise would have been the case. Now that with a little bit of retrospection, I will say that the focus in the United States on revenue raising has tended to obscure some of those other factors that I think are important. And as you pointed out, in Europe in the early part of this century, there were some significant downsides to the way those auctions were structured. And so going forward, I do think that if I were in charge of the FCC now, especially given the intensity of bidding on C-band, which exceeded my own expectations and probably expectations of everybody, I would probably focus more on making sure that we can clear the spectrum in a reasonable period of time, transition it as quickly as possible to the private sector for use, and maybe focus less on the need to raise this revenue, even though that revenue is useful, of course, for policymakers in the United States.
Mauricio, how would you see, if you could give some advice to policymakers about how to think about auction and auction designs, how to make sure that spectrum is allocated efficiently, but yet not at the expense of the cost for consumers?
Wow. Okay. So I already talked about prices. Don't make it about prices, because as it is today, the prices are on a relative basis much higher than they are in the developed world. The second thing would be the length of the licenses. The third would be the renewal mechanism. It needs to be automatic. You cannot be invested in a country with billions of dollars and go into a renewal kind of not knowing what's going to go on. That's just absurd, and it takes away from long-term investment and stability that is most important. And given that this is a regional, and this is a group that can do a lot of consolidation of policies, because of scale, it would be great if you give operators like us that operate in many, many countries some regional consistency. The US is huge and can have its own policy, but it would be great if we could have consistent policy across our regions. And I think this forum can do a lot for that. Imagine if, Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile had to deal with spectrum on a state per state basis, the scale closer would be. And I would encourage the group to go bold, because it's different in Latin America. It's not just a scale issue. We got other issues. There's been regulators in China, New Zealand, and Mauritius who basically said, we're no longer going to charge for spectrum. Do you know what? It's for the industry to go stronger. Panama did that, by the way, during the crisis, and said, here's AWS spectrum, just use it. We'll deal with the auction later on. So there's a lot of things that can be thought that basically change that complete paradigm. And I want to give this group one last thought. And I realize that this is a little bit bold and changing the paradigm. Let's not worry so much about coverage anymore. Why? 4G coverage in most of the markets in Latin America is above 80%, even close to 90%. In our markets, Honduras, Guatemala, Panama, Colombia, you would think, Bolivia, some of the smaller markets, our network already covers 80%. But usage is below somewhere between 50 to 60%. So it's not a coverage issue. People are not using broadband mobile because the devices are too expensive. Maybe they don't have access to content, or maybe simply because the ecosystem makes it unaffordable. So let's change the paradigm. And with that in mind, if we got 4G coverage that is so limited, why do we need to rush into 5G? When we got coverage that is high on 4G and yet usage is very low, let's make sure we don't rush into things that seem obvious and are not. Like, it's a game of affordability today, not a coverage. And let's finish the job on 4G, which is pretty darn good for closing that divide, gap before we rush into 5G. Let the developed countries figure out what they're going to do with 5G.
That's a terrific way, I think, to end our conversation. I'm very encouraged. Obviously, there's tremendous lessons that we've learned from the disaster of COVID, the continuing disaster of COVID globally. We've also learned a lot about the importance of investment and the role of regulators for saving economies as well as saving individuals. And then importantly, where the process can lead in terms of smart regulatory focus, not focusing on the money, but focusing on the people and focusing on the impact it has on individuals around the world. There is so much more to discuss in this area. I'm looking forward to continuing these discussions in person in future IIC meetings. Ajit Pai, thank you so much for joining us for today. The experiences that you bring both in the United States and globally are without parallel. And Mauricio, thank you so much for talking about how Latin America, how much progress has been made, but importantly, how much more progress can be made going forward. And with that, thank you all very, very much. Take care.
Thank you.